Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the head of digital media at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, Elspeth Cowell. Over to you, Elspeth.
Hello, this is Elspeth from the Canadian Centre for Architecture. Before I enter into my discussion about the implementations of a DAM and a multifaceted research institute, I want to tell you just a little bit about the CCA, as many of you may not know it. The CCA is both a museum and a research centre. Although we are not an educational institution in the formal sense of the term, education in the broad sense of engaging the public in understanding architecture and society is central to the CCA's mission. Research is at the core of our work. This presentation will focus on the research side of the CCA, in particular, research undertaken as part of the CCA-generated programming, as opposed to the more also important parts of our mission of supporting the independent work of scholars and researchers, or our role as a collecting institution. But before I proceed to give you a brief overview, in this presentation, I will introduce you to research at the CCA and give some examples, then link this to our approach to DAM. It will look at some of the distinct characteristics of our use and organization of digital assets that influence how we have implemented our DAMs. Then consider what this means in a more practical sense for the DAMs, and finally return to the interrelationship of DAM and research with an example. The CCA was founded as a new and evolving type of cultural institution. In recent years, we have moved away from the more conventional museum model of exhibitions with accompanying publications that originated from the content of the collection. Instead, our projects are generated by investigation of ideas that relate to architecture's implications of societal and lifestyle changes. To give some examples, we have explored the medicalization of architecture innovation spurred by the 1973 oil crisis, architecture as a field of critical and radical intellectual research, to name a few. Exhibitions and publications are also still an important part of our output, but we're now part of a constellation of other outputs that are becoming increasingly digital, which reflects new strategy of dissemination and extends our reach into the international context. Our projects are distinguished by being curatorial, which means that research has a visual emphasis. Projects are driven by teams that combine internal resources and external collaborators. The following three recent projects will illustrate our current output and way of working. We're working on a three-part short documentary film series. The first, What It Takes to Make a Home, questions the role architecture can play towards overcoming stigmatization of people to build more inclusive cities. The film was presented at film festivals and has been screened at the United Nations as part of the Commission of Social Development film series and is now available on YouTube. The second, When We Live Alone, explores the ways we live alone together in contemporary cities and will be released soon. And the third, On the Aging Population, is forthcoming. Our Happy Life, the second project, revealed architecture, city, and landscape as contested surfaces caught between the intangible guidelines of happy indexes, the new marketplace of emotions, and the relentless ideology of positivity. It has the appearances of a more conventional museum formulation as it included an exhibition and publication. But equally important is the digital content, a narrative documentary within the exhibition on the Gallup poll on happiness, video responses and a debate that invited architects and thinkers to respond to the research, as well as web articles on the topic and talks to the curator that are published on our website and YouTube to reach a broader audience. Our current central research project, Catching Up with Life, takes the approach further in planning our outputs for a year around a central theme that can be summarized by the question: as social structure evolves and the values and norms and rituals that define them are in a state of flux, how is architecture to keep up? The investigation takes place through various collaborations and curatorial formats, each addressing particular aspects of the topic, with an emphasis on digital output. So what does this mean for DAM? The CCA DAM vision statements emphasizes the role of DAM in supporting the broadcasting of the CCA voice as it's conveyed by our research activities and products. The DAMs is not a research tool per se, but rather documents and supports the continuity of the research process. Before I move on, I would also want to note in that context, in its current stage of development, the DAMs primarily a tool used internally by CCA staff, not a public-facing system. And in terms of the CCA, just to give you some context, we are an institution of about 100 employees. But as our emphasis on research is expanding, we're trying to take this one step further in supporting the creative process of knowledge generation. The digital assets feed into the research process leads to products, both physical and digital, that generates digital assets. To represent this role for the DAM graphically, this interrelationship of research and digital assets can be visualized as a cycle. Research is a creative process that creates knowledge that is conveyed through information. That information is communicated to the audience through digital content. That digital content takes the form of digital media, which is comprised of digital assets. Those digital assets then feed back into future research production, and the cycle begins again. To return to the DAM and the characteristics of our work and assets underlie and challenge our implementation. We would all like our DAMs to be a single source of truth in relation to our digital assets. However, this does not mean it needs to have a single point of view. The CCA DAM reflects the multifaceted character of the CCA. It supports activities from documenting our collection to producing films, exhibitions, publications, creating physical and digital public programs, to promoting these activities and as they interrelate to each other. I'll be more on this in a moment. It does not focus on a specific area, activity, or type of asset, but supports a work methodology that's centered around projects that use a broad range of assets. We aim to balance long-term management assets with accommodating the needs of a range of use cases. In addition, user roles are fluid. Users may be consumers of certain assets, but producers and suppliers of others. Let me talk briefly about the diverse range of digital assets our DAM manages. It includes documentation of our events and activities, be it exhibitions, lectures, receptions, project work sessions, and many other activities, which has led to tens of thousands of digital photos. It also results in audio and video recordings that are published on our website and on YouTube, and that are archival in nature. CCA products that may be digital, such as films and video exhibitions, or they may be physical and documented digitally through photographs of our publications, exhibitions, for example. We also have assets related to our collection, which consist of architectural drawings, prints and models, architectural archives, photographs of architecture, as well as a library. This generates primarily digital image assets, but occasionally digitized audio video material. We also have digital assets that originate from outside the CCA for our projects. This is images, audio, and video. We manage these assets to support access and used directly by internal users and indirectly by external users via our website and other digital platforms and request processes, and to support the production and promotion of our research projects. One of the distinguishing characteristics of our assets is the importance of interrelationship between these assets generated from many sources. This may be groups of assets from an architectural project within an archive, different views of a single object, such as a model or photo album, or assets that relate to different parts of a project, say views of an exhibition and a recording of the curator talking about the exhibition, for example. But it could also be temporary regroupings and assets for projects, such as images from a publication from different sources, the collection, as well as views of the exhibition and licensed external material. It is critical to us that these interrelationships of assets are central to the way the DAMS manages assets, and the DAMS also documents the process of creation of new relationships. This diagram illustrates some of these relationships. I will now talk about the 4 areas where these characteristics impact our DAMS implementation: how we define asset types, how we structure our metadata, how we organize the assets in the DAM, and how we conceive the asset pipelines through the DAM. Reflecting the different types of assets we have, we decide that rather than group by digital format, image, video, audio, etc., to group our assets by their origins, each of which can contain any digital format. Briefly, these asset types, and this will look similar to what I was talking about, the types of assets we manage. CCA content, image and audio visual files created by the CCA, whether this is event photography, exhibition installations, or digital products themselves, such as films, video, and audio recordings. Collection, digitized image and audio visual files and material in the CCA collection, or external content, image and audio visual files from outside the CCA used for CCA content. User roles, ingest and distribution pipeline, as well as metadata, differs by asset type. This breakdown by asset type carries through to the guiding principles behind our metadata, which, in addition to the expected requirements, searchability, discoverability, and having the right metadata, also emphasize the need for metadata to meet the specific needs of each asset type. The last principle on this slide is also important. Metadata can be created efficiently by a range of users. To implement these principles, each asset type has a distinct metadata scheme, which allows the metadata, especially the descriptive data, to reflect the specialized needs of the type. It also can differentiate how the data is gathered, as well as the different metadata for assets with the same digital format. The distinct collection asset type also facilitates the harnessing of integrations with the collection management and library databases to bring in and update collection data in the DAM. In the case of CCA content, a further metadata field, content type, allows subschemas. The metadata needed to classify images and requires an event is quite different from that needed of photographs from an exhibition, portraits of people, or the assets related to a film. Some fields are global across assets types, in particular technical information on asset, file, and rights information. Importantly, project name is a global field and can be used across asset types. Mandatory fields are kept to a minimum to simplify ingest while still ensuring all assets include critical metadata. The difference between asset types and their metadata is illustrated by this table. The importance of interrelationships is also emphasized by the organization of the asset. Our DAMs has a flat structure, meaning assets are not organized into logical folders in the file store, which could be seen as a disadvantage, but it has had in fact been an advantage in forcing the assessment and development of metadata that makes explicit the interrelationships of assets. Equally as important, especially from the perspective of the user, is the ability to regroup access into temporary, in some cases, longer-term selection for use and discoverability. The DAM functions as a workspace for digital assets. It's fostered by the creation of selections by the digital asset team linked to the front dashboard, which points users to assets that are useful to them as they're added to the DAM. This utility is augmented by user-generated shared selections on projects. This diagram summarizes the sources of assets and metadata, but by asset type and also by generalized use. The gray arrows show you where the assets are coming from for each of our asset types, whereas the yellow arrows show you the sources of metadata for each type. Like the different metadata schemas, asset types have different pipelines in terms of workflows and restrictions. Ingest into the DAM will be done by professional producers, primarily photographers, digitization technicians, and the audio-visual production team, as well as staff contributors who will receive assets from external sources, as well as in some cases create them themselves. In terms of the workflow, we also emphasize the use of the DAM as a workplace through the creation and sharing of selections, trying to break away from old habits of duplicating and proliferating files and work processes. I always like to say that there is very few people who need to download files, especially high resolution files. And one of the benefits of a DAM, obvious to us professionals, but oddly not fully grasped by many users, is you can always get the files again. To this end, we have tried to balance easy access to assets of reasonable quality to support internal and presentation users, and give access to high resolution files only to those users who actually need them for the production of our products. In our pre-DAM process, required digital asset team member to release all but very low resolution files to all users manually. This diagram shows the differences in ingest and downloaded between the different asset types. As you can see, for the collection type, the ingest is almost exclusively by professional producers, and there is some level of restriction on the download as there's copyright implications. For CCA content, both professional producers and staff contributors may be adding assets to the DAM, but the download can be done by key staff, as in this case, we have copyrighted or licensed use of almost all those images. In the case of external content, the upload is primarily staff contributors for getting resources from external sources, but we need to have some level of restriction on the download as there's copyright implications related to the specific projects. To come back to the link between the DAMs and research at the CCA, there's three important conclusions. How the DAM is organized and used needs to reflect our research work process. Supporting this process will lead to opportunities to better manage assets, both in terms of core user use cases, but also specialized ones. For example, we're developing a process that enables users to ingest Zoom recordings of research meetings and informal presentations, meaning that they will not become liabilities without metadata on our servers. Thirdly, the DAMs need to describe and document the projects that we do, as well as the assets through strategic metadata and managed selections. My concluding example presents the progressive generation of digital assets for a research project and the intermixing of assets in terms of type and purpose, as well as how the DAM documents the process. The iCamera window project centers around the photographic research of Takashi Homma on the architect Le Corbusier's use of windows. This was undertaken in 2016 and 2018. The photographs of Takashi Homma were then presented in a book called Looking Through Le Corbusier's Windows, co-published by the CCA in 2019. Naturally, this process led to the generation of digital assets, image files of the photographs of Takashi Homma, images of the book, and photographs of the spreads of the book for promotional purposes. But this was only the first stage. Photographs were then paired with some of the drawings by Le Corbusier in the CCA collection, representing the DAM by digitized image files. The photographs by Takashi Homma and the drawings by Le Corbusier in their physical form were then presented in an exhibition at the CCA, currently on review. The exhibitions was photograph resulting in more image files. The image is supported by an audio introduction, digital assets in the form of WAV audio files, as well as a video interview of Takashi Homma generating video and subtitle files. And we're now producing a video of the exhibition space so it can be presented on our website and YouTube channel, more video files. And the chain of research, content, and assets hopefully continues. If I was to show you these assets in the CCA DAM, they would be classified in all three asset types, with metadata distinct to the descriptive searching and rights need of each one. The metadata for all assets would also include the project name to facilitate the assets related to this project. Easily accessible folders with selections would group each of the categories of assets I described, as well as subsets such as press images and promotional selections by the curator. The arrangement into selections and the inclusion of project-related metadata allows the DAM to reflect this project's process and hopefully foster its continuity. I will end by saying that we are very much still in an implementation phase with our DAM to the CCA. So my daily work is often focused on ingest schedules, wrangling assets, and metadata problems. The development of this presentation gave me an opportunity to look back on the decisions we made in planning the implementation and reflect on how they link to our research process. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Elspeth. That was a fantastic presentation. If anybody has any questions at this point, please do enter them into the Q&A section and we'll take those. We have a little bit of time now to take some questions. I just wanted to say, first of all, Elspeth, I love that you said that research is a creative process. That means that I, as a scientist, am also a creative, and I love that.
Yes, I like that analogy too, because it also links research to digital content creation in a way that we don't really think about that often.
Yes,
which I think is also very important to how we think and conceive our DAMs, that this is a support mechanism for research, and that we can't have, if we just have research and we don't create it into content, it doesn't have any, we can't convey it to anybody.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So you get that full cycle, and I love that. Yes. I think that's so important to capture. Brilliant. So I noticed that you have an incredible vision statement, and thank you for sharing that with all of us. I wondered if you could take us through a little bit about how did that vision statement come about, and how have you used it to support the program?
Surprisingly, that vision statement was started very early on. And I'm surprised when I went back to it to actually do this presentation, how little it's changed. I mean, how much that what we said we thought the DAM was for has continued through into the implementation. And it is very much tied to the CCA mission. When we wrote that vision statement, we really did look back at the CCA's mission and look at how what we're trying to do in the DAM supports that. And this is where the idea of broadcasting the CCA voice is important. And I think where it has kind of moved on a little bit from the point where we did that, which is probably 4 years ago now, is that we are also expanding more and more the way we conceive of research. So the research aspect, not just the broadcasting of the voice, but the generation of research has moved on. But I mean, it also tries to balance the very pragmatic part of DAM, which we all know about from our day-to-day operations of this is something that this is just where our assets are that enable people to use them, to conceive of it in a much broader context of what our institution needs to do. I mean, we're a small institution. I mean, relative, I'm listening to the Yale presentation this morning and thought, okay, that's just so complex compared to what we're dealing with. And that also gives us a benefit in the sense that we can conceive of our dam in the way that we do, of kind of working around our projects and our way of working, which is, I know, is much more difficult in a larger and more, segmented institution.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting to know that your vision hasn't changed a huge amount. I like to hear that.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, no, so I'm glad of that too. It means we thought it through well.
Exactly. So Emily has asked, do you have the relationships defined where research leads to content? So a sort of bibliography. Oh, that's an interesting one.
Oh, that is an interesting question. Not really within the dam. We do have other kind of systems outside of the dam. The actual research development, obviously it happens outside the dam, and this is a kind of a difficult juggle always, especially since we are such a visually oriented institution. There's a lot of kind of digital assets that our research staff and our curators are working with at the beginning phases of a project. And there's always a question, when do we start managing those in a dam? When do they really need to be managed? And we have kind of made the decision right now, that that's kind of a research and development phase. It's when it kind of needs to be actively used across the institution that it brings it in. So in terms of kind of bibliography, that would certainly be outside the dam rather than within the dam. I'm not sure if I've answered that well, but it's kind of the way we conceive it.
Yeah, because you showed us that really great diagram of all of the relationships and how everything fits together. So I could see where research might be part of that, but like you said, maybe it's also better, it sits better in a
because I mean, we don't manage our kind of dam. I mean, any kind of actual research content in the sense of, say, PDFs of papers, anything like that in the dam. It is really visual content in our dam. So.
Brilliant. And we've had another question about the uniqueness. Is a dam implementation in an educational institution, do you consider that unique and different than perhaps in a corporate brand?
Oh, definitely. I mean, we're kind of an in-between in the sense we have a museum side as well and a collection side as well as a research side, which also makes it unique. But I think that in the kind of products that we need to create that we're conveying to our public is different than what we're in a corporate situation. I think is really driven by digital content as digital content in itself, not digital content that relates to a product. I mean, our digital content revolves around our research ideas, our projects, rather than our product. I mean, there's similarities for sure. I mean, I definitely want to get over into the museum collection side of it. My experience is it's surprising in that world. You just replace collection with product and how those are similarities because of the whole collection management system interconnections. But on the broader sense of what we are doing for our digital content that relates to our projects, I think it's definitely distinct because it's the projects and the products themselves that are digital that we're managing.
And another question is about integration. So you mentioned that you showed that, again, a great diagram. I love all the diagrams that you had. You have those various sources of assets and metadata coming from different places. Have you done much in terms of integrations?
At the moment, we have done integration of our collection management system, which I think is incredibly critical in this process because that is the source of information on assets in our collection. So that is really critical, that integration. We hope eventually to also do integration of our library system, which is another part of our collection, because similarly, that material is in that system, and we don't need to repeat it in the DAM system. That is a bit more complicated in some ways because it's one more step removed. I mean, our collection, the images are of something we own, whereas when you come to books, it's a slightly different relationship. We don't digitize books as a whole, we digitize parts of books for uses. So it's a somewhat different relationship there. going back to our research systems, we have kind of a database that they use for research purposes in a longer term role. I'd love to integrate that, but that's much more complicated because it's also less structured than collection management or library systems.
Mm. And then thinking about the opposite kind of end of the spectrum, if you're saying integrations are kind of coming up in some ways, if you think back to the selection process or early days of implementation, Sophie has asked if you could talk about an unexpected challenge that you faced during that early period.
I think the biggest challenge, in a sense, was actually how we organized our assets. That really was a challenge. I mean, when we went through the process of selection, everybody was, looking at video, audio, images, and that seems to be a lot of the way people structure their dams. And when I started looking at it, I realized this just wasn't going to work for us, because that kind of, if we were going to say our metadata schema related to our images and then made our video, it wasn't going to work. And so this is where we came to this division, which I came up with. That was also confusing for a lot of people, I think, especially when you're working within an institution which has other a collection management system, other structured metadata systems, where people are used to their standards and their processes there, whereas the DAM, the metadata is built from a very different perspective, a perspective of discoverability within our own internal context. Yes, it has an external reach for this, beyond this, but in an internal context. And this whole idea that there'd be multiple metadata schemas that relate to the asset based on where they kind of came from, in terms of whether we produced them, whether they relate to our collection, or whether they're coming from external. That was challenging to get across to people that was the best way to go. And I stand by this decision, even as we move forward. Every time I struggle a bit, because also having those three metadata schemas is also structurally very confusing at times, because we actually have three fields. We actually more than three. We have many fields called title, for instance. You can search them together. Our DAM instructions, if we search them together, but they're actually in different metadata schemas. So in the way it's structured on the back end. So this is, this was difficult for people to understand, that, isn't a title just a title and you just need it everywhere? But it's like, no, if you want that title to always be mandatory, not necessarily in that metadata, in that type of asset, but this type of asset is not a very good example, because title generally is mandatory anyhow. But if you could, the flexibility we wanted across our asset types needed those multiple schemas, and that was people coming from kind of a more library-based or collection-based, that was confusing.
And I think that perspective is really important, and I think it's brilliant the way that you've structured it, because I've seen the sort of thing where because you've structured it this way, you're able to have kind of some preset metadata fields, and you're also able to streamline which metadata people see depending on what they're entering, so they're not overwhelmed by.
Yes, that is also really critical, and this comes back to mandatory fields versus non-mandatory fields. It's like, yes, we want people to put some metadata there, because if not, what's the point in having a DAM? But on the flip side, we do not want people to see this whole array of things that they feel they might want to put in there, because then it becomes much less controlled. So let's just get in what we really need and worry about all those extra things later, when, and that's where the digital asset management team comes in, is to try and make sure that what we're doing is systematized across the system.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So we have time for one last question. And this question is about, how do you track the rights of the assets? Do you do that in the DAM or elsewhere?
It depends a little on the assets. Obviously, for collection assets, there's a certain amount of asset information related to those collection assets in our collection management system, which we'll pull into our DAM. For our own assets, that is one things that we create ourselves. That management is actually directly within the DAM and solely in the DAM. Also for external, and this is actually an area that we're still in the development of, is where it becomes super critical, because it's project-based use. So we need to manage the licensing of those, as well as the expiry of those. And that's actually an area that's not yet fully developed, but yes, that will be within the DAM, and it will also have to then interrelate to other ways that we're managing those rights in our work processes. It's actually one of the challenging ones, I will say.
Lovely.
Oh,
Well, Elspeth, thank you so much for sharing this amazing use case with us. And if anybody does have any further questions for Elspeth, she's going to be joining a Meet the Speakers table next at the Birds of a Feather Networking Lounge discussions. So you can take a seat at a virtual table in the Networking Lounge tab for a thought-provoking discussion with fellow attendees. Tables are first come, first serve, so go and join Elspeth there and keep chatting about this great use case. Or you can visit the exhibition or take a short break and grab a cup of coffee. Just a reminder that session recordings from today's event will be accessible over the course of this week on the agenda tab. Thank you again, Elspeth, and thank you everybody for joining.
thank you.